34,000 years ago, in Russia, two kids were buried, side by side, covered in over 10,000 hand-carved ivory beads, 20 armbands, 300 pierced fox teeth, 16 mammoth ivory spears. Each single bead took roughly an hour to carve by hand, using nothing but stone tools. Do the math. That's more than a full year of non-stop labor, buried underground, with two children who never lived to grow up. So today's question is simple. What did it actually mean to be rich back before money, before writing, before civilization even existed? We tend to think wealth is a modern invention. Stocks, houses, bank accounts, expensive cars. But archaeologists keep finding proof, again and again, that the moment humans started living together in groups, some of us already had dramatically more than others. The haves and the have-nots aren't some unfortunate side effect of civilization. They might be baked into human history from the very beginning, long before anyone thought to invent money at all. At a site called Sunghir in Russia, archaeologists found the burial of an adult man in his late 30s or 40s, covered head to toe in red ochre and roughly 3,000 ivory beads. For a hunter-gatherer, that's already an insane amount of wealth. Each bead had to be individually carved from mammoth tusk, by hand using stone tools. Impressive. But right next to him, two children, around 10 and 12 years old, buried head to head in the exact same site. Their grave held more than 10,000 beads combined, plus 20 ivory armbands, 300 pierced fox teeth, 16 mammoth ivory spears, carved artwork, and deer antlers. More riches than the grown adult buried nearby. Way more. And here's the twist. Researchers studying the boys' bones found signs of physical difficulties and repeated stress, meaning they almost certainly weren't hunters and probably never contributed labor to the group at all. So why were they buried like royalty? The leading theory among archaeologists, their wealth wasn't earned through hunting or skill, it was inherited. Which means 34,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before farming, before writing, before the wheel, some humans were already being born rich. Here's where it gets even wilder. In Poland, archaeologists studied a Neolithic cemetery near a settlement called Osłonki, dating back around 6,600 years. They examined the bones of 30 individuals, all buried within roughly the same 200 years. By analyzing carbon isotopes trapped inside those bones, scientists can literally reconstruct what a person used to eat decades after they died. And the pattern that emerged was striking. The people buried with the fanciest grave goods, polished copper ornaments, also had noticeably richer, higher protein diets than everyone else in the same cemetery. In other words, wealthy people back then weren't just buried better once they died. They were eating better their entire lives. Every single day. Their bodies were quite literally telling the story of inequality, thousands of years before writing was even invented, before anyone had a word for rich or poor. Here's the part that makes this even more interesting. The copper found in those graves didn't come from anywhere nearby. It had traveled hundreds of kilometers, all the way from South Central Europe, through a long chain of trade before it ever reached that village in Poland. Which means owning it wasn't just about looking good. It meant you, or your family, had access to long-distance trade networks that most ordinary people simply didn't have. Sound familiar? It's basically the prehistoric version of flexing an imported car, or a watch shipped in from overseas. The rarer and harder something was to obtain, the more it marked you as elite, connected, and powerful within the community. And when that trade network eventually collapsed, around 4,400 BC, those copper ornaments vanished completely from the region and didn't reappear again for an entire 1,000 years. Fast forward a few thousand years to the Bronze Age, and wealth display got even more theatrical. Elite families controlled access to bronze and gold, essentially cornering the market on the two most valuable materials of their time. They were buried in massive earthen mounds, deliberately built tall and wide enough to be visible from far across the landscape, a permanent monument announcing exactly who had power. Some of the gold bowls found inside these graves were hammered so paper thin they physically couldn't have held a single drop of liquid without collapsing. They weren't drinking cups. They were never meant to be used at all. They were pure status symbols, objects that existed for one reason only, to say, look how much I have and how much I can afford to waste. Basically the Bronze Age equivalent of a solid gold phone case that would shatter the moment you actually tried to use it. The idea of inequality, some people having dramatically more than others, sometimes just from being born into the right family, isn't something civilization invented. It shows up the moment humans started forming stable communities, long before farming, long before cities, long before anyone had ever seen a single coin. Wealth back then wasn't cash sitting in a bank account. It was beads. It was ivory. It was imported copper that most people in the group could never get their hands on, no matter how hard they worked. But strip away the objects, and the instinct underneath all of it is completely identical to today. Status, display, and the drive to show the world exactly how much you have. So next time you think status symbols and flexing your wealth is some kind of modern obsession, remember, 2 kids were buried 34,000 years ago, wearing more wealth on their bodies than most people around them would ever see in an entire lifetime. Turns out, humans have been showing off what they own for a lot longer than anyone ever expected. Do you think inequality is something humans are naturally wired for, or something we created along the way? Let me know in the comments.